Autodesk, Microsoft, and Symantec. And Jonathan, pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to come on the show. It's really great to be kind of in the catalog of great shows that you have and have the opportunity to share a little bit more about the views of turning a customer service center into a profit center. So I appreciate the opportunity, Kate.
Yeah, and what is interesting about your background, Jonathan, is you have done various types of companies, from security to office applications to Autodesk and Kabamas, fully in the gaming space, and now you're in the gaming space. So it's fabulous to see the entire customer success and how it has been. It's rare to see people who have had decades of customer success experience. So it's wonderful to have you in the show.
No, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So let's start right there, actually. Since having the decades of experience, Jonathan, tell me a little bit of how you have seen customer service change over the years.
Well, I think it's interesting. So when we go back to the 1980s, right, there's this very kind of brick and mortar viewpoint to services. It was at the early times when we started to see kind of technology morph to where contact centers or call centers, started to come about. Then you go into the 90s, and that infrastructure at the kind of the boon of the internet at the end of the 90s enabled that type of capability to be serviced outside of the local country, whatever the local country was, right? I was in the United States, so United States. And then we fast forward really quickly into the 2010s, and we went from, hey, we can contact, to all of a sudden there's text, there's email, there's chat, there's Facebook, there's all these different ways that customers can access brands. And what changed in that moment was this concept where brands now could hear from their customers more often, understand their customers more, and the customers had a lot more information and data to make better choices. And they started to make different choices based off of how brands started to treat them. And then as we fast forward, up through the 2010s into now into the 2020s, we're noticing that customers are making choices based off of how brands treat them in the customer experience, and they're making their choices with their feet and with their money. So it's been an interesting transition of how consumers and customers make their business and their brand choices based off of how they're treated.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that you brought in the data evolution along with the customer service revolution when you answered this, Jonathan. So one of the things we say is metrics are good, but metrics doesn't say a story, data does. Do you actually see the way brands are relating to customers? The amount of data that they are using is more and more, and how do you see the data transition also over the years?
Well, I think what's interesting is, well, data is like super important to companies. I think consumers don't always think about it in that valuable sense, right? They think of, oh, I'm not a number, I'm a person, treat me individually, customize it for me. But the reality is, it's for companies to be able to deliver that optimum service, that best-in-class service that drives stickiness, loyalty, and so forth. They have to have the data to understand, what the customers are doing with their product, inside their product, and so forth. And so I think that over the years, one of the things that you see happen kind of in the early 2010s was this idea of a unique identifier that could identify a customer across an entire company or entire product suite. And the reason why a unique identifier was created partially was for security reasons, right? To protect the customer, protect the client, the business, and so forth. But the other component of it, which people didn't realize at the time, was it enabled the company to be able to correlate data between different parts of the company. So for example, it allows this correlation between customer experience and profitability, as an example, right? Or like adoption and usage and different product suites or different product features that come out. A company can now say, oh, we launched feature X, And based off of what all these key clients are telling us, based off of using it and loving it or not loving it, right? That tells us whether the product feature was a good product feature or not, in addition to, anecdotal feedback from the market or from the individual customer. So I think did the transition and maturation of going from very limited data in the 80s to big data in the 2020s has been just as important in this framework of creating profitability through customer experience as it has as the actual activities or the processes that a customer experience team does to drive that profit.
Yeah, and Arise has been actually following a CX maturity model. And I would love to understand how you see that model will make support teams proactive. And how do you see that transition from cost center to profit center? I know that's two different questions, or two, if you want to split it and answer, that's fine too.
No, totally. So to give a little context, so I invented the maturity model called the service tech maturity model at the time and trademarked it. But the idea was when I started Officium Labs, I'd been working in large enterprise and startups and gaming companies for some time. And what I realized was that there wasn't like a simple, easy to use framework or model that you could go and join a company and all of a sudden look at like, oh, okay, based off of this model and this framework, I have all the features necessary to create profit and communicate profit, to the power cores in the company in a way they understand it. And so what I thought I would do is I said, hey, well, what if we treated customer experience as if it's a product? Mm-hmm. So if you create a product, what you tend to do is you create a framework of what the product's going to be, right? And inside of that product framework, you have pillars that we'll call feature sets, maybe major feature areas, right? And then for each of the major feature areas, you have feature components that build that feature area, right? So for example, if you're building, the Microsoft Office product, right? They have 7 or 8 different types of feature sets, and then they're like, well, we want to add this, we want to add that, and the same thing with the video game, the same thing with any type of product, right? So I said, well, let's build a customer experience product, or let's at least think that way, right? So change the mindset. And we said, well, what are the pillars that we need to have inside of this product? And then what are the features inside the pillars? So for example, like workforce management, learning and development, interactions, products, those types of things, right? Quality, operations, those types of kind of pillars. It's like, okay, so those are the pillars, and then what are the features that need to exist? And so we built it out and we said, okay, these are the basic feature sets. If you want to run a basic operation, of course, when we use that word, basic had a different meaning than it does today. Basic has a very different meaning, the urban definition of it and whatnot. But generally speaking, the next one was, what's the standard look like? What's the next feature set? And then what is best in class look like? And then, what does next generation look like? So we built it that way. And so for the users, my cameras are going in and out because I have this great AI camera that loves to bring comedy into my life. So that's why my camera is zooming in and out whenever I use my hands. But plus, it's a good comedy break. But the idea, Kay, was that if you build a customer experience with the product mindset and you have these features, then you can help companies understand, like, where are they at in the maturity model, or where are they at in the customer experience product to be able to mature to a state where they can deliver profit. And the outcome is if you have the best in class features or the next generation of features of the maturity model, we can 100% show you how to correlate the work you're doing in customer experience, customer service to profit.
I love it, because suddenly when we treat it like a product, what happens is it enables the entire company to become customer oriented, customer obsessed, customer focused company, right? So it's easy for all the teams within the company, within the organization, to tune in to the customer very easily, because then there is a framework that enables a company to tune to that and say, okay, marketing, this is what I need to do. Sales, this is what I need to do. Product, this is what I need to do. So I love that. So can you summarize the 8 pillars, and then we can dive into at least a few of them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so when we look at the pillars, you've got the interactions, and interactions really includes all of your technology. So it's the non-human facing interaction component, like everything that sits behind that makes the interaction possible, whether it's AI, technology, CRM, and so forth. Then you have kind of the operations piece, and this is really about all the different processes and how you interact and engage, with that human being on the other side. Do you use vendors? Do you have an internal? What are your frameworks of success? Your methodologies, those types of pieces. Then you have the quality piece, which really looks at the overall experience and what type of quality experience you're delivering, whether you look at quality from customer effort, customer satisfaction, NPS, whatever it is, it has that piece. Then you're looking into the learning and development piece, which is how are you training, onboarding, and equipping your people to be able to talk to the customers, engage with the customers, and then be proficient, in that piece. The next one you have is, we call it content management, but it's really looking at your knowledge base, the knowledge that's out there, whether it's through self-service or, whether it's through, using social channels like Discord or other components and pieces. The next one looks at the product itself, which is like, we firmly believe that when you design an experience for a customer, you design it at the development table. You don't, okay, the product's launched, service, go make the customers happy. Like that's old school thinking.
Yes.
And so we're like, so inside of it, we have this whole concept of product liaisons that need to sit as in the experience design piece, design it and develop it, and then you go to beta or alpha, then you go to beta, and then you launch it, right? So those are some key components overall. And then we kind of look at, what's the rest of, the tech stack that supports the organization, that doesn't really have to do with the interactions itself, because there's a lot of tech inside of the experience side, right? And then you look at kind of the pillar looks at the customer journey, looks at, the journey mapping and all of those different components and pieces. So it really kind of, it sets up these different overall pillars which is a little bit more complex for someone that's trying to follow along to what I'm saying now, so we can share a visual of it later. But the most important thing is then, what are the features that you have today? So how do you assess against that? And then what are the key features that you want to add over the next 12 months, right? And so every company is going to be a little bit different in that component. Some companies will want to invest in interactions or AI. Some companies don't have a quality program or DevFM program, and they're going to want to invest in those things first, right? And so it's going to be different by company, but the goal is, how do I create ROI? How do I create profit? And then once you have the unique identifier set up and you have the correlation capabilities, the power of the maturity model is then doing A/B testing and proving out, like, what does correlative values or correlative profit look like for your business? Because it's going to be different for gaming, which is the hat that I'm wearing, right? We have gaming clients, we have healthcare clients, we have finance clients, clients all over the world, tech clients. It's going to be a little bit different, like how you drive profitability or correlation of profitability and what A/B tests you need to do and so forth. So that's doing the assessment, understanding the model, but then actually putting the model into application and driving it as a business strategy, a business transformation is just as powerful, and having the mathematical data to verify and validate the work that you're doing has the impact. That's kind of the soup to nuts of it.
Yeah, so what is interesting for me is if you look, the model that you're talking about, if you take the interactions, right? So the interactions are the actual records that are there in the system. The second one you talked about is the activity that is happening with the customer. And if I tie in with the unique identifier, I know what are the existing records with this unique identifier. I know what are the interactions or the activities that are happening in any channel. that's happening with the customer. And then I can start correlating, saying, how is this piece of interaction that's happening right now with customer, with quality, with learning and development, with the product, and all of that. And suddenly you have a nice fleshed out full interaction where you have the intelligence built in. And then you take, thousands or 10,000s of several of those interactions, and then look at the patterns and the anomaly of those interactions. It becomes a beautiful, intelligent layer that's more customer first. Did I get, I gave the same view of what you mentioned, but more from a data perspective, but does it align?
Yeah, no, I mean, it totally does. And I think the reason why I created a maturity model is because what I found is that there's a big disconnect with how people at companies that make funding decisions and the services team themselves. And so it was a big frustration, a big tension between the services teams and the power cores, as it were, at a company that are making these investment decisions. So what I thought was important is, how can we talk in a language that will help the power cores in the company understand the importance of investing in the customer experience side, right? And that's where it really comes down to, like, that was the simple question. I'm a big believer that simple questions lead to the next generation of innovation. And so that was a simple question I asked myself. And then I was like, okay, well, in order to do that, it's this, and it's the maturity model and the application of the transformation. But then the most important piece is, then how are you communicating back to the power cores at the company, the impact? And that's where one of the biggest things that the power cores have to get over is investing in the unique identifier. Because most companies, they'd be like, well, we've been around for 30 years. A unique identifier across 45 databases is going to be really hard. Yeah, it's going to be really hard, but it could also drive 10 to 20 to 30 million dollars of future revenue for you as well. And so helping them understand and correlating that is super powerful. And then demonstrating the impact of, like, yeah, hey, you gave us $1 million. We protected, or we created $4 million or $5 million of revenue based off of that $1 million funding that you gave us. And that conversation is just as powerfully important to the overall success of the services team creating profit center and communicating than the framework itself too. And so I think that's important to know.
I love how you mentioned about the powers of be who make the decisions. So let's talk a little bit about the various people who are making the decisions for this funding and the kind of roles and how it differs from your experience.
Well, it's super interesting. So I think there's like 4 or 5 power cores inside of a company. And in any company, it's never the same group of people that have the actual power versus the perceived decision-making and authority. And so you look at IT, you look at finance, you look at marketing, you look at sales, and then you kind of look at the executive team and product. So those are kind of the 6-ish power cores. In some companies, product drives everything. Like, product is the power core, right? And you see this a lot in startup companies. You see this in companies, that are more tech, industry companies. But then you go into other companies like financial or healthcare, or companies that have been around for 30 years. And I find that oftentimes finance and legal are the power cores in the companies, it's super interesting to me, because it's different than like a product power core company or a finance power core company. I think what's most important is to understand, like, do an analysis on who actually makes the decisions in your company, and then what's the decision process that they go through to make decisions, and then how can you then speak in that language? And I think that's the most important thing to think about. Like, I was with a gaming client a few years back, and it was clear that finance was like a power core in their company. And so the way that I pitched the maturity model and the value that it could provide was a little bit different than a gaming company where tech was the power core, right? And so it was much easier to get tech to do the single identifier than it was for finance. And so you had to talk in a different language. Like, for as an example, tech was like, yeah, it makes sense, we should do it. Yeah. And they were ready to go. And they're like, yeah, let's do BBI and big data and let's do this. And they were ready to invest much faster, right? Whereas a finance company or finance power core was like, well, actually, what's the ROI? Take me through these 5 presentations to convince me and prove to me. And then I want to follow up every week afterwards. So one way is not bad or right or wrong, but they're just different. And so it's important that as you start to think about how do I talk about profitability and the customer experience area, you just have to know who your audience is and what's important to them, and then how you can frame the language to help them get the value out of it.
So there are a lot of people watching this who are from the support background, and one of the biggest things that they are asking is, how do I take this argument to the decision makers? It's changing a little bit with the chief customer officers themselves making those decisions, but they have to work with the rest of the company. So I think what would be wonderful for this audience is, let's take it through these examples that you talked about. Let's talk about, stories are wonderful, Jonathan. For example, this finance, and how did you do it for the finance with the CX maturity model?
Well, I find the easiest way to start with any power core is to start with, it's a magical word. I love it. It's called a pilot. And most power cores are willing to take risks on a pilot, but they might not be able to be willing to take risks enterprise wide, right? Or company wide. And so what I tend to find is it's really important for the customer service team to identify a group of customers, whether it's a product, whether it's a delineation of customers inside of a product or whatever it is. Find a group of customers that you believe, like you've done a hypothesis, like, hey, these group of customers will definitely be able to demonstrate profit. We have a hypothesis they will. So in video gaming, as an example, a mobile game company that we worked with, the top 2% of their customers generated 80% of the revenue, right? And so for us, we're like, hey, let's focus on doing a pilot for the top 2% of these customers. Let's identify what we're going to change for these 2% of the customers versus the rest of the customer base. You can call that an offering, right? What's the offering different, the pilot offering going to be? What are the processes and the methodologies and the policies that we need to change for this pilot? And then what's the data that needs to be recorded or adjusted in order for us to be able to demonstrate whether the pilot was a success or not? And then what's the key success measures of that? So you build all that, and then you take that presentation proposal to the power core. In this case, it was the finance team, and then for the finance team, it's really important for them to understand how this impacts the bottom line. Yes. So we build the entire presentation to do all that, but then also talk about like this is going to be an investment of X, but it's going to deliver an ROI of Y, and we're going to be able to know that this ROI was delivered within 8 weeks or 10 weeks, right? You give them a time frame, and then you set up the meeting to talk about the success or the findings of the pilot, right? And then from there, was the finding statistically significant enough to scale it, or do you need to elongate the pilot for another 6 weeks or 8 weeks to get that statistic significant, bit? And then you present it to them and so forth. And in this case, we were able to present it. The pilot was a success. We scaled it, enterprise wide, based off of the fact that they saw the ROI, they saw the stickiness and the retention numbers, they saw the stickiness and the increased revenue attribution, and so we were able to do it, right? But the most important thing is to start with the pilot, experiment, have a hypothesis, prove your hypothesis, and make sure you think through all of the processes, the policies, the methodologies, the data structures, the technologies, all that bit, right? Put it together and then propose that. And then make sure you have your finance number of what you need for funding versus what the output is going to be. And then you can at the end, you can attribute what the success of the pilot was or not.
You essentially gave a full framework for the proof of concept, right?
Yeah,
so yeah. That's essentially, yeah. right from the planning all the way to the measurement of the proof of concept too. So at the end, there is no questions about, oh, was this even successful? There is very clear on what that success metric would be. So at the end, the decision makers can participate in saying, yes, this made sense. Now, how do we go and deploy this? And in what stages do we deploy? That's very good. Would you like to add anything else with respect to the framework if it was a different decision maker?
Well, I mean, I think that like if you're talking to like a technology or product power core, they're interested in the ROI, but they're also interested in like, well, what could we change in the product in addition to what you're doing in the service? It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe if like after the beta test, we like that, we'll just build it into the product, right? And then it will just become part of the product and it could drive that attribution. So they just have it. It's more of a like, hey, how can we use this next? Yeah, give us the ROI, but then let's build this in the product so we can scale it. And it's not a manual process. So they tend to think, which you're a creator as well, Case. I know that you think this way too. It's like, oh, really? That's awesome. And how do we build a product so we don't need, so much manual intervention. So we retain the customers earlier in the cycle versus later in the cycle, right? So product like something like that. Somebody that's from a legal standpoint, they'd be like, oh, that's great, but are we giving away? Is there any risk or like, are we going to lose all these other customers because we're doing this thing for this customer? Or what about the data? Like, is it going to be GDPR? Is it, those types of things, right? You have to go through all that for any power core, but those are kind of the questions that they'll want to have the answers to, right? If you talk to an executive, maybe an executive that's more high level, they'll be like, I don't even know about anything. All I want to know about is what's the service metric, what's the ROI metric, and give me a weekly update, right? So it'll just depend on like who the power core is and how invested or interested they are in how you make the sausage versus the sausage being made, for lack of a better metaphor, versus the sausage and how well it tastes and how much customers love the sausage and all that jazz.
Yeah, so essentially in that proof of concept, the ROI being the metric for the finance person, and that metric changes if it is a product person or something else, if it is marketing or sales. So, and that's kind of how the metrics tie back to the profitability of it. So, hey, at this point, you don't know anything about your customer experience of the product, but here it is. When you tie all of this together, you have real-time feedback on how customers view the product and what changes you need to make to the product, and that is the driving force for turning it into a profit center. So the CCO drives on who the decision maker is and what is the metric that's going to resonate with that decision maker. Beautiful.
No, it's totally. And I think that as you do that, create that decision maker and help them become a sponsor. And that will be the next powerful thing as you have these conversations. Because if you have a sponsor, you're good. That's outside of CS. If you can get an executive sponsor that has influence in the company, then you're not only going to be able to try this first pilot, you're going to be able to do other experiments. I love a Nelson Mandela quote, I never lose, I only win or learn. And that's a very iterative way of thinking, which is like, hey, either I won or I learned something, and now I'm going to go try something new, and I'm going to win at that, which tends to be more stereotypical of a product or a tech power core. But in essence, like I think any company that wants to be successful, they have to iterate. Long ago, waterfall was the way that we did project management. Hopefully that's gone, because it doesn't allow for iteration. It assumes that you're having like, this is the product, we're delivering the product, let's see what customers think, it's a very risky way to do it in my viewpoint. So, but it's an iterative way. And I think that if you can get a sponsor, and they'll be like, okay, well, what's the next project that we're going to do? What's the next experiment that we're going to do to drive stickiness and retention? And then what you'll find is once you prove that pilot out, you'll get other power cores like, wait a second, like, how are you doing that? oh, wait a minute, I want to know, how can you help me think about that for marketing? Or how can you help me think about that for sales? How do we drive that same mentality? Maybe the framework is different, but in the customer journey, how do we drive a mentality of experience design and retention proactively rather than just reactively? So then you start to get this interest across the entire customer journey.
Yeah, I know we are running out of time. I want to squeeze in just one little thing into the conversation. How do you create the urgency?
The easiest
How
way I
does
think
it create that urgency to make this happen?
you show the amount of money that is being lost because of it. Like that's the other important piece is like when you look at the industry data, and I have industry data I could share. Maybe each particular customer experience person has their own data, but essentially I always like to do an analysis, a simple analysis to do. This is all open source, right? Giving it away. So, but simple analysis is, what is the revenue generation of customers that never contact support versus the revenue generation of customers that do contact support? Do that analysis. And full stop, 99% of the time, what you'll find is that customer service or customers that contact support are stickier, they drive greater revenue, and they have more of an impact on the future. And so that revenue difference is saying, hey, all these customers that never contact support, they just leave. They don't have a good experience. They don't care about the brand. They don't care about the product. That's money that's on the table that's lost. That's how you create the sense of urgency. Usually in large companies, that's millions of dollars. And that starts to speak to people.
Yeah, and then you can start showing urgency on what is the weekly loss, right? So then you need to get to it now to make it important. And I like that metric. Anything else that you would like to add to it?
Well, I mean, I think that as you think about it from a high level standpoint, I always think about two words. How are you protecting your customer, but how are you optimizing the experience? And so that's those two words are kind of what helped us build the maturity model, because different pillars in the maturity will protect the experience, different features, and other features will optimize the experience. I think as an example, like protecting the experience is really understanding who the customers are, how they want to be engaged, meeting them where they are, as an example, versus where you want them to be. But optimizing is looking at, well, how does AI help my customer have a better experience versus a human-to-human engagement encourage better experience? So those are just very simple examples of how you protect and optimize. But as we built out the framework and we built out the maturity model, that's how we thought about it.
Excellent. So protecting the customer versus optimizing the customers, understanding how to create the urgency around how many revenue generated with customers who reach out to support versus not, and then building out that framework for the proof of concept to make it a reality, and then driving from that proof of concept into the entire deployment to make this a customer-wide phenomenon. So thank you very, very, very much, Jonathan. I think you have given a full framework. It feels like there's a lot we covered in a short time, and it feels like there's still more. And we will certainly bring you in for a further conversation, but I really appreciate the time that you took today. Thank you.
No, thanks for the opportunity. If anyone has any questions about it, they can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or you can find me. I'm at Chief CX Officer on TikTok, on Insta, and a variety of other places, YouTube. So thank you so much, Kay, for the time to share my thoughts and add to all the wisdom that that your podcast and your livecast has. Thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely. The last 20 seconds of silence.